Yasmin Arakan. Well, whatever Boris Johnson promised a year ago today when he became Prime Minister, delivering Brexit, fixing the social care crisis, closing the opportunity gap, cementing what he called the awesome foursome incarnated in the Union flag, at this exact point, his premiership is likely to be defined by the way he's handled the COVID crisis. As he also told us in that first speech in front of the door of Number 10, the buck stops here. Today, he admitted to the BBC's political editor that looking back on the COVID pandemic, a lot was learned and understood along the way.
I think, Laura, when you look back at this crisis, everybody can see that this was something that was new, that we didn't understand in the way that we would have liked in the first few weeks and months. And I think probably, the single thing that we didn't see at the beginning was the extent to which it was being transmitted asymptomatically from person to person. But I am very proud of many of the things that people in our public services did, that members of the public did to deal with coronavirus.
Well, to reflect on that first year in office, I'm joined by Associate Editor and Royal Editor of the Daily Telegraph, Camilla Tominey, and Sonia Sodha, the Guardian columnist and chief leader writer of The Observer. Camilla, first of all, that sentence, the buck stops with me. Do you really believe that he thinks he's got anything wrong during coronavirus?
I think there was a sense of regret, wasn't there, in that interview with Laura. I think because the government is under no illusions that there probably will be a public inquiry when the time comes, although I think Johnson himself has tried to put that off. And questions are going to be asked and lessons are going to be learned, as they always are. But I think particularly when it comes to care homes, many people in the industry feel that the government failed them. Equally, we'll have to make a reassessment of the death rate. There's been some controversy over that because of how some of the figures have been gathered. But on one hand, I think supporters of Johnson will say, look, pardon the pun, but he was handed a hospital pass. It's a fledgling administration and not many would have been able to have triumphed in this. And there's been criticism of other leaders. But on the other hand, with the Barnard Castle debacle and Dominic Cummings and all the rest of it, you do wonder whether they may have been making more of a meal of it than was strictly necessary.
I will certainly come on to Dominic Cummings in a moment. But Sonia, has any modern day Prime Minister, do you think, had a more testing first year?
No, I don't think that. I think this pandemic has been an absolutely extraordinary challenge for a government. But that said, I think Boris Johnson has failed a number of key tests on it. So I think, Camilla mentioned the incident with Dominic Cummings, but there were even more serious incidents that we saw, failures around testing, contact tracing, care homes, procurement of personal protective equipment. And I think the problem is, it's one of Boris Johnson's former cabinet colleagues described him to The Guardian as a good time Prime Minister. And these just haven't been good times. And the problem is he lacks attention to detail. We know that's been a problem for him before in City Hall. And I think he just hasn't been close enough to what's going on. And we've seen government make error after error.
Will he try and offhand, do you think, to the scientists?
Well, I don't think that's going to work. He's tried to say we're following the science. Actually, if you look at SAGE, the Government Scientific Advisory Committee, if you look at their minutes, they said on the 16th of March, measures need to be taken as soon as possible to implement a lockdown. It didn't happen till a full week later. So I don't think that he's trying to do that. I don't think it's going to work.
Well, so Camilla, is it inevitable then that despite, the victories that he delivered on the Red Wall, despite the very healthy majority, which allows him to do things like radical action supposedly over obesity, just as Tony Blair was defined over Iraq, do you think Boris Johnson's premiership will be defined by COVID and how he deals with the aftermath, especially with a looming recession?
Not necessarily comparative to Tony Blair and Iraq, because that happened towards the end of his administration. You find him at the beginning of his, really, Johnson, and it's an administration of two halves, because obviously before Christmas it was characterised by a degree of chaos in regard to Brexit, prorogation and all of those issues, and now we have this. Of course, Kirsty, you're right, he's going to be judged on his ability to try and repair Britain economically and recover from this, and it's all going to be about the economy stupid.
And the backbenchers are getting, and the Tory backbenchers are getting restive, and I wonder if you think that Dominic Cummings will still be at his side by the end of the year.
Well, the problem with Cummings is not only the criticism that Johnson had to field on Cummings's behalf, but also this wedge he appears to have driven between the Prime Minister and, as you say, Tory backbenchers. He's made no secret, Cummings, of his dislike of politicians and particularly of Tories. There's this sense that he's being moved off onto this civil service reform project, but he's still an ever-present figure in Downing Street. But I would suggest that if there is another, heaven forbid, Barnard Castle incident and more front pages that seem unattractive to number 10 with Cummings' name attached, then he may have been a cat that's used up all of his lives.
Well, Sonia, you know, whatever you think of it, he got Brexit done, whatever ends up with a trade deal. Is it possible, though, if that's what he would regard as a win, the lose will be that he loses the union?
I think it's very possible. I think both if you look at the Brexit challenge and coronavirus, the way he's handled both of these things has actually served to shore up the case for Scottish independence. And we've really seen the polls on that start to shift in recent weeks. And we saw him go up to Scotland this week. He didn't really seem to have a plan to convince Scots to stay in the union. All he seemed to say was, well, you're very lucky to be part of the union. It would have been much worse on coronavirus if you hadn't. Now, when you look at perceptions of how Nicola Sturgeon has handled this crisis compared to Boris Johnson, fairly or unfairly, they are far more positive for Sturgeon. So that kind of pitch just doesn't work. And again, I think the lack of attention to detail, he apparently cares about the union. That doesn't really seem to be coming across in what he's doing. So I really do think that his legacy might not just be one of the worst death rates in Europe, might not just be a terrible Brexit deal, it might be the breakup of the union as well.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, that is it from us tonight. Emily's back on Monday, but for now, have a great weekend. Good night.